Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. As I mentioned in my best books of fall video, I moved apartments fairly recently. I have been in the slow process of getting settled and kind of organizing my space, and part of that has also involved reorganizing my bookshelves. And I've gotten to the point where I'm feeling fairly set, for now at least, about where all of the books have kind of landed throughout the apartment. And so I thought it might be a fun time to do my first ever bookshelf tour to show you where I keep my books, how I organize them, and also to highlight some recommendations from my library as well. Earlier this year, I did do a top 20 books in my library video where I went through and kind of picked out my 20 favorite physical books that I own. And so this time around, I'm going to try and highlight some other books, although I probably will mention some of those top 20 just because I can't help myself. But if you do want to hear a little bit more about those books, I will link that video down below if you want to go check it out. Before we get started, just to give you a kind of overview, I currently keep my books in 3 primary spots in my apartment. The first one is this credenza TV stand, which is a new addition to this apartment, as is the TV behind me. It's the first TV I've ever owned as an adult, so I'm clearly trying to make best use of it already. The second place I keep books is my actual bookshelf, which is currently in this little inner reading room that I have in this apartment, which is kind of weird but also really nice. And then the last place I keep books is in another sort of credenza TV stand type thing that I have kind of transformed into a horizontal bookshelf of sorts. So I have books throughout the apartment, which is really nice. And I would say that there are a handful of core organizing principles when it comes to how I organize and separate my books. The 2 biggest ones I would say are separating the read books from the unread books, which I think is fairly common. And then the other big one is that I do like to separate my favorite books from all of the rest of my books. So I tend to keep some of my all-time favorite books out here on the kind of TV stand, and then I keep my other favorite books on my main bookshelf as well. And then the bookshelf credenza thing in my bedroom is where I keep kind of all of the rest of my books. And where there's a kind of favorites tier to my read books, there's also a sort of hierarchy to my TBR piles as well. So I have a small TBR pile out here with some books that I'm hoping to get to soon. I have another shelf on the main bookshelf that is a TBR stack that I'm feeling excited about, and then the rest of the unread books that are at the bottom of my TBR are in the bedroom. But those are also fairly fluid piles, so I often kind of move things around depending on what I'm feeling excited about and what I want to get to next. So those are the 2 big overarching guiding principles to how I organize my books, and then within individual book piles or bookshelves, I tend to like to organize things roughly chronologically by pub date, which I know does not really make sense in terms of any type of Dewey Decimal System, and it certainly is not as easy a way to search for your books as alphabetical organization is, but I don't know, it just kind of makes sense to me to organize them in that way and to kind of put them in chronological order so that you can see the sort of history and literary history progress as it moves across the shelves, if you will. That being said, when I say roughly chronological, I would put the emphasis on the roughly part of it, because I do think that there are some idiosyncrasies where I diverge from that for the sake of aesthetics or grouping a collection of one author's books together on my shelf. But now that we have covered all of that, let's start with this favorite shelf out here. So as you can see, this is where I like to keep collections of some of my favorite authors' books. So I have all of my Elena Ferrante books collected here. And as much as people like to dunk on the covers of Elena Ferrante's books, particularly the Neapolitan novels, I will say that the spines of Europa books look really good together, and so I always like to keep those in a stack. Over here I have Villette, which is one of my favorite books of all time and one of my top 20 books in my library. And then I also have my Eileen Chang books here and my Joan Didion collection as well. And the only reason that the Eileen Chang books are separated is because Lust Caution is too small to go in the middle of the stack. Below that, I have some of my other favorites books, and you know, these are a little bit arbitrary in that they could be swapped out with a number of different books from my main bookshelf where I keep a lot of other favorites. A couple of books that I wanted to highlight from the favorites shelf are Sansei and Sensibility by Karente Yamashita, which looking back, I really thought had been in those top 20 books that I had picked out earlier this year, but apparently not. I read this last year and it was one of my favorite books of the year. I was thinking about this book recently because one of my good friends read it and really enjoyed it, and it was just an opportunity to kind of go back and be reminded of how smart and funny and surprising this book is. It is kind of a book in two parts where the first half is a collection of some of Karente Yamashita's essays and short stories from the 1970s to now, all of which look at, in various ways, the experience of being Japanese American, and particularly the Sansei generation, which is for the most part the children and grandchildren of the Issei and Nisei generation who were incarcerated during World War II. And then the back half of the book are these funny, spoofy takes on the works of Jane Austen, transplanting them to a Japanese American Sansei setting. And I just love Karente Yamashita and want to read a lot more of her work, but I definitely recommend checking this one out. And then I also wanted to highlight Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, which I read a few years ago at this point, but I was thinking about it recently because I am reading my second Richard Wagamese book right now, which is Medicine Walk. Richard Wagamese was an Ojibwe writer from Canada. This is a book that looks at residential schools in Canada and also hockey as a Canadian national sport and something that's part of Canadian national identity. The book follows a kid named Saul who is sent to a residential school and experiences a lot of trauma there, but also falls in love with hockey while he's there as well. And the way that Richard Wagamese writes about hockey is so beautiful. And then the way that he explores and reckons with what hockey is and what it means, particularly when it comes to Canadian nationalism, is really thought-provoking and heartbreaking. And I've been reading some books recently that deal with sort of sports and the way that sports are often used as a way to assimilate people and as a sign that people have become Canadian or American or whatever it might be. I'm thinking specifically about the book The Eagles of Heart Mountain by Bradford Pearson, which looks at a football team that was formed in a Japanese American incarceration camp. And I feel like so many of those books are so interesting but don't fully reckon with the nationalism and assimilation of it all. And I think that this book does a really good job of considering those questions and also just telling a beautiful story that is heartbreaking but also hopeful in its own way at the same time. This is also the shelf where I keep my paperback editions of Robin Hobb's Live Ship Traders trilogy, which is the first fantasy series that I read as an adult, and I initially read them on Kindle but loved them so much that I wanted to have physical copies, and I just love the way that these ones look. And then I wanted to point out on this shelf the best used bookstore find I have ever happened upon, and that is a 2-volume edition of a true novel by Minae Mizumura, which is a Japanese retelling of Wuthering Heights set in post-war Tokyo. I read this book a few years ago and absolutely loved it, and I do have the single volume edition of it, which you will see soon on my bookshelf in the other room, but the book has also been printed as 2 volumes because it's about 800 pages. This is the original cover of the book, but then this beautiful slipcover has the kind of inverted color design, which I think is really beautiful. And then the books themselves also have that sort of black and crimson design. And then the best part about it is that the covers are these incredible black and white photos of a man and a woman. This is a book that I love, and to come across this special edition of it randomly in a used bookstore was quite the thrill. So I keep that one out here. Then here you can see some of the big books that I'm hoping to get to potentially in 2022. One of those books is Kin by Miljenko Jurgovic. It is a 900-page tome looking at a Yugoslavian family over many years and generations. This is a book that I really want to read in 2022, especially after having read some great Balkan writers this year. That being said, I did start it a couple of months ago, and I think that there's a lot of European history that I need to refresh myself / learn about for the first time, because even the beginning of the book is referring to certain borders and kind of groups living in certain places that elude me. So I also have Post-War by Tony Judt as a book that I want to read in 2022, potentially to help with some of the history in kin. This has been on my shelf for years. I was technically supposed to read most of it for a class in college, which did not happen. Even though kin, I believe, is looking at events even prior to World War II, I feel like this book about the history of Europe since 1945 could be potentially helpful just in terms of orienting myself within this bigger book, but also probably just a good thing to know on top of that. I'm feeling increasingly in my nonfiction reading for next year that I really want to pick out some big chunky books that I can just slowly make my way through, and also potentially be okay with not reading these books cover to cover necessarily. So we'll see how that goes, but this is one of those books that I would hope to have on the list of sort of chunky nonfiction. And now moving on to the main bookshelf, which also has a lot of my favorite reads. On the first two shelves here, I keep, for the most part, some of my favorite read fiction, and this is where I do organize it fairly chronologically. So here we have some high school editions of the Brontes, which I still have, my much-loved copy of Middlemarch by George Eliot, some other top 20 books from my library like My Antonia by Willa Cather. This is a vintage copy of A Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys that I recently found at a thrift store. And here is my single volume edition of A True Novel, and some British editions of Pachinko and Normal People, which I got because I preferred the UK design to the US design. Down here, we're getting even more recent and contemporary. Here is The Lying Life of Adults by Elena Ferrante, my one Ferrante novel that did not make the cut for the favorites shelf, mostly because of space constraints and because it is a hardcover instead of a French flap paperback like most of the other ones, and also just because if I had to pick one Ferrante to leave off, it would probably be this one. I also have a fair number of recent contemporary romance novels on this shelf, like The X Talk by Rachel Lynn Solomon, People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry, which I read this summer and loved, and The Love Hypothesis, which I did decide to buy a copy of for reasons that I'm now not entirely sure I agree with, but it is staying on the shelf for now, I guess. Down here, I keep some of my favorite read nonfiction books. Some of the ones that are on my top 20 list are Pilgrim at Tinker Creek by Annie Dillard, Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, and We Were 8 Years in Power by Ta-Nehisi Coates. And then down on the bottom shelf, I also have some other books that are towards the top of the TBR. Some books that I wanted to highlight from this part of my library are my portable Dorothy Parker collection, which I don't think I've ever talked about on this channel. I was a huge Dorothy Parker stan in high school. I feel like the combination of her wit and kind of morbid sense of humor really appealed to me in my most emo years of life. We also had to do a project in either my junior or senior year English class where we had to dress up as one of our favorite poets and give a speech from them or something like that. And so I dressed up like Dorothy Parker. So I've had many editions of Dorothy Parker's poetry throughout the years, and I think this is the one I've held on to just because it's the most comprehensive. I obviously have flagged some of my favorites here. This is one that I actually don't revisit that often, but it's definitely one that I feel like I will probably hang on to forever just because she was a favorite of mine at a younger and more tender age. Another favorite book that I had to read for high school was Long Day's Journey into Night by Eugene O'Neill. Again, I feel like this book really appealed to my emo self, especially in the way that this family is discovering that the American dream is a sham, and then I also think it just has some monologues in it that really spoke to my 18-year-old self. The one where Edmund talks about being a ghost of the fog at the bottom of the sea or something like that is definitely a favorite. And this is an old school, quite threadbare, worn edition that I found at a used bookstore a few years ago in California. It has Eugene O'Neill on the cover. So this is one of those books where when I saw it, I grabbed it just because it is a very beloved favorite, and it's kind of nice to have a cool, if somewhat ratty, edition of it as well. This book didn't make my top 20 books in my library, but I also wanted to give it a shout out. It was one of my favorite books of last year. It is Nothing Ever Dies by Viet Thanh Nguyen, and this is a book that the longer I sit with it, the more I just love it. I think about it a lot in terms of what it has to say about the Vietnam War and America's involvement in it, and also just the way that the war machine functions more generally in American culture An American Memory. It's also one of those really nice university press books that just feels really good. I love the cover and the color of it, so it's one of those books where whenever I see it on my shelf, I'm just happy to have it there. So wanted to give it another shout out as well if you're feeling some slightly more academic nonfiction, but also the way that Viet Thanh Nguyen writes, especially if you read his fiction. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's just beautiful, and so even though it's a little bit dense at times, it is also just a pleasure to read on that level. A couple other books from this shelf that I wanted to shout out are Golden Gates by Connor Doherty and Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, which are two books about San Francisco and the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. This book looks at the housing crisis in that metro area and in California more generally, and then Uncanny Valley is a somewhat dishy memoir about Anna Wiener's years working in Silicon Valley. And I feel like the Bay Area maybe isn't interesting to anybody who doesn't live there or hasn't lived there, but these are just two really fantastic books. I think Uncanny Valley especially, I would encourage people to go out and read because it's just so well written, and it's that kind of insider look at something that I think you get a lot of in publishing and media and those kind of East Coast industries, but you get far less of it in tech. And I think that these two books pair really well together. Connor Doherty's book is also quite funny and sharply written in its own way. And so yeah, I just wanted to highlight these ones as well because I feel like I don't get enough opportunities to encourage people to go read them, especially Uncanny Valley. I feel like should have had a wider readership than it did. I understand why people on the East Coast are maybe not interested, but I think in terms of the writing quality, it has a very Joan Didion, Gia Tolentino for Silicon Valley kind of vibe to it. I also wanted to highlight Reading the Romance, which is another academic book about romance novels, which I read last year and really loved. I'm still intending to make a video about romance novels more generally, and this is a book that I'm definitely going to enjoy going back and revisiting my annotations and notes on. And then the last book from this favorite shelf that I wanted to mention is Bloods: An Oral History of Black Veterans in the Vietnam War, edited by Wallace Terry. And The Sorrow of War by Bao Ninh and The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien are two of my favorite books that look at the Vietnam War. And this just pairs so well with both of those books and looks at a different angle of the war in terms of how it was specifically quite difficult for Black Americans, both at home and on the war front, I suppose. And it's also a very different kind of format in that it is these oral histories of all these different kinds of men who are in some ways very different, but also bonded by certain common experiences of discrimination and whatnot. This is just a great book to read if you are reading some of the other classics about the Vietnam War. And I also just like having a sort of classic mass market edition of a bestseller from years gone by. And then lastly, I have all of the rest of the books in my library. I keep all of the read books on this shelf roughly in chronological order, and then these down here are all unread books, but also not ones that are at the top of my list necessarily. Although some highlights here would be The Possessed by Elif Batuman. I also have some nonfiction out here that I would potentially include in that chunky nonfiction TBR project for next year. And this shelf also has a lot of classics that I often forget about. I actually haven't done a great job of reading classics in the last couple of years, so every time I see them on this shelf, it's a reminder that I do want to get to them eventually. And then on top here, I also have books that I just keep up there somewhat for aesthetic purposes, but also books that are just part of my general TBR. In terms of highlights from this shelf though, here is a James Dean photo book that commemorates the time that I fell deep down the James Dean rabbit hole, winter of 2011. Here is my high school paperback edition of Long Day's Journey into Night. I also have a copy of The Wall of Winnipeg and Me by Mariana Zapata, which is a massive self-published romance novel that I read a couple of years ago and really loved at the time. And I think the extent to which I enjoyed it was very funny to me. And so I got a hard copy of it. Although now when I look at it on my shelf, I'm like, was this that good? I don't actually know, but I keep it here just for the lols. And then, you know, I have books on my shelf like Asymmetry, which I found interesting at the time, especially in the context of conversations that were happening about, you know, autofiction and who should write what stories. At the same time though, this is a book that I will probably never reread, and it's also not one that I find myself recommending or giving to friends, so that's probably one that would go in an unhaul. I think if I were ever to do an unhaul, these are the ones that I would probably look at first, both in terms of books that have been on my TBR forever that I'm maybe never going to get to, and also in terms of books that I enjoyed and wanted to hang on to for various reasons, but that upon reflection are maybe books that I don't need to keep long term. I don't think I've reached that point yet in terms of running out of space, but this is definitely the one that would be most in flux. That being said, there are a lot of great books on this shelf, even if they aren't necessarily favorites, so it is nice to have the space to keep so many of them as part of my library for now. So that was my little bookshelves tour. I hope that you enjoyed it. I know that some people do more in-depth looks at everything on every shelf, but I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the things in my library, where I keep them and how I organize them, and also pull out some of the highlights for you as well. And like I said, if you want to check out that top 20 books in my library video, that is linked down below too. I would love to hear how you all group and organize your books and what is most important to you when you do that, how you feel about having a library, if you're someone who really enjoys collecting and having those books with you, or if it doesn't really matter to you that much. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!